Welcome to LCRL's Liberty Alert in Washington, D.C. with your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz. Talking two kingdom citizenship, bold biblical principles for a robust public Christian life. And now, your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz.
Hello and welcome to LCRL's Liberty Alert. I'm Dr. Gregory Seltz, and we're here every week. It's our weekly foray into how to live as a two-kingdom citizen, faithful to God, in service to our neighbor, and engaging the culture. And that includes politics. And like I said, we're finding out again how dirty business politics really is. But we do all of that for the sake of the culture. We do have a cultural role. Things can get a lot worse, but ultimately it's for the mission of the church. Everything we do has to be for the mission of the good news of the gospel. And it's Lent. And so again, Lent, if there's one thing that Lent teaches us, like we talked about last week, is that our good works can't accomplish the big things in life. There's a futility even of our best efforts. And of course, Lent teaches us that we need repentance and that we actually need God's solution for a lot of these things. So again, Lenten repentance means a boldness in understanding that our freedoms, the true freedoms and the foundation of our freedoms, they don't come from us. They come from God, and things like dignity, humanity, even civility, those come from knowing God, not from our politics and not from our cultural machinations and not even from our successes or failures when it's all said and done. So today we're going to be talking again about a two-kingdom mindset, what that actually means. Today we're speaking specifically about vocational respect that seeks the truth or that seeks justice. But vocational respect is key, and that is a uniquely two-kingdom way of thinking about things, because God is at work in the civil realm, not to save people, but to keep, for lack of a better way of saying it, keep all hell from breaking loose. And so, there is an order to things, and there is an ordering of things, and we do need to learn how to engage that order, because right now I think Christians are very confused. When we get involved in a lot of these political, cultural debates, there's an evangelism side to those debates, and then there is a politics or a preserving side to those debates. And you have to differentiate those issues, and a lot of Christians can't. They're either one way or the other. We talk about the way things are received today. You've got a conservative political kind of view of things, and then you've got this secular progressive view of things. And each one of those has a role to play, I suppose, in our culture, but not a saving role. And that's where our two kingdoms comes in and says, okay, you guys can hash it out, but you're just doing the basement floor work. How we live our life should not be controlled by those discussions. Again, if you're a two-kingdom person, like we've talked about before, you know that God preserves the world and God saves the world, but he does it in two radically different ways. And so give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's, but even God has a way, has directions for how Caesar's supposed to do his business. So again, today when we talk about that, we want to talk about a two-kingdom honorable citizenship, and that starts with this idea of vocational respect. Even respect for those with whom we might disagree, but of course we expect the same in return. And then we're going to talk about this word subsidiarity. And it's not really our word. The Catholic Church uses it, but it does kind of clarify a perspective that we also share as well. And it's really how to order authority in our lives. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then, of course, when it's all said and done, our lasting freedom starts with our relationship to God, to one another, and then outward to society freely. It doesn't come from government to us first. And so there's going to be a clashing of these two ways of thinking about things, because there's a lot of people today who not only don't believe the church has any role to play, but they believe the government is all encompassing. And again, for those of you who believe that out there, you just got to go back and look at the 20th century. There was all kinds of political movements like that wanted to get rid of the church, elevate mankind to kind of its secular supremacy, and every one of them turned out very, very badly for people. And so again, our experiment here in America may not be perfect, but it still provides the structure that allows people to be the best they can be on their own terms for their family, for their friends, for their neighbors, and of course, it has to be self-disciplined and again, religiously motivated is ultimately the key. Or else people are going to start looking to the wrong place, like government, to solve the big things in life. So today, I'm going to talk to you about 2 mom and pop papers. These are things that I've written on this stuff, so you can take a look at them. They'll be posted on our website. And we're going to read an article, or at least reference an article on subsidiarity from a Catholic writer, but it'll give us a clue as to what I'm talking about, because I'm going to say that all authority flows from the 4th commandment, honor your father and your mother. That's the top level. You know, these are God's structures. These are God's vocations, family, church, and government. And government's not the big one. Family and church are much more important in God's ordering of things. So we're going to talk about that word. I like that word because it gives us a way of talking about how to delineate authority, how to hold authority in its proper place and proper respect. And then we've got a really good op-ed coming out in April 23rd on the sexual orientation stuff and gender identity, and how parents, you're the ones that are key to all this, because your kids need you. And your kids need, when kids are struggling with these kind of things, we're born male and female, but we all struggle with what does that mean as we grow up. And we have a great article by Peter Scared that's coming up, and so look for that, because it's really gets to the heart of why it's important for us to engage in these things. All right, so today, 2 Kingdom Mindset, Vocational Respect, seeking the truth or seeking justice. Now, another document that I'm going to put up on our website is called the 2 Kingdom Principles for Public Engagement, or for Public Policy Dialogue. And again, these are things, if you believe that God works 2 different ways in the world, one to preserve, which is not his saving work, and that's why government is an emergency organization of God's. It's not something that's going to endure in the next in the new heavens and the new earth type of thing. And like the founding fathers actually said, if human beings weren't sinful, there'd be no need for government. But we've got 8 principles there, and I'll just run through them really quickly. When assessing our moral and missional responsibilities in the public square, Christians are aware of God's 2 distinct ways of engaging the world. That's number 1. Number 2, both the government and the church are legitimate God-given authorities in our lives and in the world, but they have specific delineated roles according to the Bible. Number 3, the differentiation between the purpose and work of the church and state is actually a Christian worldview. People don't think about that today. Number 4, the differentiation God places between church and state involves their sphere of influence and their methodology of service. And then here's the one I want to talk a little bit about today. A healthy society should honor the uniqueness of the family and the distinct purpose of the church in its polity, while also then recognizing the limited sphere of government. That's something right now that people are, even politics, there are people who think that government should be in charge of everything. First of all, it's bad politics. And second of all, biblically, it's bad politics. Okay? And so, and it's just going to lead to things, the consequences are going to be loss of liberty, loss of freedom, and things that you'll never get back once certain people control the levers of the power of the state. Let me jump to the 8th one. Christian engagement in the political realm asserts that government has a vital, here it comes, but secondary or penultimate purpose which supports the family and allows the church to do its work. So again, when you're thinking about these things, the bigger problem happens when the government gets out of its lane. And isn't that amazing then how our founding fathers understood that? And that's why there's a thing called the First Amendment, to protect the church and people of faith from government coercion. And all that's being flipped around. People are looking to the state to solve all of our problems and to coerce different dialogues into one unified whole that will only be bad for all of us in the end. Now, in the Mom and Pop papers, the first one I'm going to talk to you about is it's called Two Kingdoms, Public Vocations for Service, a message whose time has come. So what I mean by that is that the first thing you should be looking to, if you want to look to something to solve some of the issues in your community, you should be looking first and foremost closer to home. And that starts with mom and dad. So honor your father and your mother is not just not just a commandment. It starts to delineate the proper understanding of authority. So when it comes to authority, mom and dad, God first, but mom and dad in your life are first and foremost in this world. And then from there, it cascades down into things like, teachers or community leaders or police or those kinds of things. But they all have a derived authority that needs to honor fathers and mothers. And so if you've got public policy, for instance, that starts to do something that takes away the legitimate role of a parent to their children, that's not only bad policy, that's destructive policy. So, what's interesting to me today is, again, we're the ones that are accused of actually enforcing with politics our worldview, and it's really the exact opposite today. Even the evangelical church, which has a little bit different view of how law works, they actually believe we can solve some of these problems through good law. We just believe that good law preserves us from our worst intentions. But we tend to talk about the same issues because of that. But there's another group that thinks all things should be political. Our country, even liberals and conservatives, didn't think that way just 30, 40 years ago. I mean, do you remember when people used to say, don't make a federal case out of it? You remember that? What happened to that idea of things? Because everything is a federal case now. And that's just not right. And the idea that we can impose our views on some of these fundamental issues by virtue of the power of the state, we can bankrupt you, we can get you fired, all those kind of things. That's a terrible way for us to live. Even if we disagree with people, we should try to find a way to honor and to be good neighbors to another to the best of our ability. And so today, virtually everything is made to be a federal case, and that is anti the vocational way of doing it. So you can already see that that's not going to honor God's vocations out there. It's definitely not going to honor the vocation of church. It's not going to honor the vocation that comes from the structure of the family. It's not going to honor the vocation that flows from being a child of a particular family or a person in the neighborhood. It's going to look to federal overseeing governmental agencies to solve problems in the neighborhood. And again, that kind of stuff is detrimental. Detrimental to freedom for sure, but it's detrimental to good. It's detrimental to civility, to humanity, those kind of things as well. That's why I love this word subsidiarity. There's an article we'll post it. It's a key principle in Catholic social teaching, but some of the ways that they talk are helpful for us too, because subsidiarity is this. It says a community of a higher order should not interfere in the life of a community of a lower order. So higher meaning, bigger, broader, more generic, lower being kind of like your family, the thing closest to home, depriving the lower order of its functions. But that higher one should support in the case of need and help to coordinate its activity with the rest of the society with the view of a common good. So basically the whole point is this. That when it comes to where to look to solve the big issues in your life, things like your identity, your humanity, your purpose, and all that, you don't look to something. And when he says higher order, that doesn't mean better. It just means broader. So like the government would be a higher order, the family would be the lower order. But in that sense, the lower order has preeminence. The lower order is the place where there are more prominence. It is the ultimate authority. And honestly, our culture is built on the notion that the individual first has individual inalienable rights before government because they come from God. That's the lowest order of all, properly speaking. And then in family, that's the next level of authority and responsibility. Authority and responsibility always go together, and we don't talk enough about responsibility. We got everybody protesting today, but are taking responsibility for what you're supposed to be doing? I don't see that happening. I see more and more that protest is supposedly my responsibility. No. If there's injustice, that's one thing. But then tell me how you are fulfilling your vocational responsibilities. And we don't hear enough talk about that kind of stuff. So what it's saying is that a healthy understanding of liberty, respect for others, love, civility, all these things flow from those lower orders outward. So from oneself before God to then family before God to neighbor, and then neighbor before God to one another. And then ultimately, government is the last recourse for our worst intentions. But it's not the first place you go. So again, they use the public school system kind of thing as their example. And I'm a big believer that, we have totally messed up the school system because we've dishonored the family's role in education. And so parental choice is the best way to rectify that. The last place you want to do is give this stuff over to bureaucracies who actually look at your children as nothing more than a group or a number on the page. I'm not saying that teachers don't care about their kids in classroom, but it's not their responsibility to be the parent. The parent takes that responsibility, that role. And so ultimately they should also have the choice as to where their kid goes to school, the kind of values that are being instilled in their children. And that is what's being usurped today in our system. And parental choice is the only way to do it, because you're never going to, the unions are way too powerful. They already have our money. They'll just continue to play this stuff off, even if education continues to get worse and worse and worse. But if you give parents the responsibility of educating their children and then give them back the resources that are egalitarianly collected and then dispensed, so everyone has an opportunity to get a good education, quality education, you'll see competition explode. You'll see parochial, private, and public schools back in the city, and you're going to see people who are educated, and education is the number one way to get out of poverty, as well as rebuilding the family units in our culture. So again, any way that we can figure out how to do that together in our dialogue, let's try. But again, so I'm saying that subsidiarity, that's kind of that's that message that's come, and that's kind of what we're talking about, because vocation is the place where significant service begins. And that's why our founding fathers understood that, and they made the First Amendment and your individual relationship before the law the key. And religious liberty was the biggest issue in every one of the founders. And when you look at all the political documents of some of the first organizations in our culture, religious liberty was key. And if you're a Lutheran, LCMS Lutherans, they fled from religious persecution in Germany so they could also have freedom here in America. And again, that's what drew many of the people, and that was the big issue with England too, because the king wanted a state church and he wanted to control people, and religious liberty and having the right to dictate to those in authority what level of service we needed from them, that was key to it all. Now, it's really interesting. A lot of people think this notion of citizenship and stuff is universal, and you don't understand how incredibly unique it is in human history. One of the articles I do talk about in my Mom and Pop paper is an article by Lyman Stone, who's an LCMS guy, and it's in First Things, called Two Kingdom Theology in the Trump Era. Well, it's no longer the Trump era, but Two Kingdom Theology is just as important, or even more so, in the Biden era. But he argues again for vocation. That has to be what the government's undergirding. If the government starts to take the place of healthy vocations, that government is out of its lane. And he talks about this whole notion of what it means not to be a subject to rulers, but to be a citizen where the government really serves us. And this is something that's pretty well known in all kinds of historical writing on the uniqueness of America. But this notion of you being a citizen with inalienable rights is so new in human history that you should be thankful that you have it. But the people in power don't like it when people have that notion of their autonomy, that notion of self-discipline, that notion of being motivated by God, not by economics, not by politics, not by any other ism, but ultimately being free to take care of one's family and to serve one's neighbor. That's the best way to ensure that there's freedom for the most people. So in the first one, I just said vocation, this idea of vocation, public service for people that doesn't flow from government, but actually government does its job of undergirding it and then tries to stay out of its way. That is the kind of best way to deal with a lot of the issues we're dealing with today. And cancel culture and all these different things where government is used and government fiat is used in protest and basically intimidation, that's the opposite of such a notion. So look across the fence to your neighbor. First, look to your family, then look across the fence to your neighbor. And as only a last resort, call the 911 of public policy as your solution. And even if you look for the 911 of public policy, do it in your state or do it in your community first before you call the feds. And so that was the first one I talked about. The second one I want to talk to you about is vocational respect, seeking the truth. And what I mean by that is that you honor other people's vocations before you kind of jump in and have your say. I always use this example when I'm lecturing. I say, let's say you're at when we were younger, when my daughter was younger, we were living in New York City. And she went to school on the Upper West Side in a small Christian school, grade school. But across the road was Columbia University, and for those of you who know where Columbia University is in New York, that's where the Seinfeld restaurant is and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of cool. But one of the things you ran into when you went to eat up there is you ran into older parents because, you had a lot of people, education, it was like the ultimate thing. So you had a lot of double PhDs. People didn't get married till they were much older. So you'd see people in their mid-40s with maybe a, 3 or 4 year old in the restaurant. It was always kind of funny because, there's something about like overly educated people. By the way, overly educated people who think that parenting is something you read in a book. It's something that flows from a natural understanding of what's right and what's wrong. It flows from an understanding of how God disciplines His people. That's that kind of stuff. And there's a whole lot of common sense out there that flows intergenerationally between families. And it's only these folks who think that we can come up with a brand new way of doing all this thing as if human nature is something we can manipulate. I get a kick out of it anyway. So yeah, and there's always this situation where there's a parent, and they've got little Jimmy, and he's like 3 years old, and they've instructed him about his uniqueness and his autonomy and their personal space and all this kind of stuff, because they have this new way of doing parenting. And then you see Jimmy take the spoon and he dips it into the carrots and he flings it at his mom or his dad. It hits him, boom, right on the head. Now, I always tell people, when you see that happening and you see Jimmy like digging in again and then they say things like, now, Jimmy, Mommy and Daddy talked about this. This is you're violating our personal space, and we expect that you will not do that. And he's looking and going, man, they're not going to stop me. And then he whips it and does it again and again and again. And I would say to people, what don't you do? Because you know that right now, that's just not the way you deal with this. What you don't do, because you have vocational respect, is you don't run over there and say, well, excuse me, but, I've got several children or blah, 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 blah. Let me explain to you how to raise your children. No, you don't do that. Even if you think it's wrong, even if you're struggling with what you see there, you don't do that. You have respect. You know that God can, He can keep things relatively peaceful through all kinds of ways where people honor moms and dads, and they honor personal property, and they honor people's names and reputations, and they don't covet people's stuff, and they don't steal people's stuff. Even though their heart might not be in it, people who just try to do it right, or even if their heart is in it, trying to do it right, that can preserve a society. That can preserve, and there's a humanity in that neighborhood if people of all belief systems at least struggle for that level of morality. And so you honor their vocation, or you have respect for their vocation, even if you see what they're doing is like, this could be problematic as that kid gets older. Now, I always tell people, now, if little Jimmy, lobs a long one and hits me in the forehead, I might walk over and say, I think we got to stop this. But even there, I wouldn't do it maliciously. So But again, what you'd rather do is get to know the folks and be good friends to them, be good neighbors to them. If they ever struggle and say, how did you handle this stuff? Then you lovingly talk about how, kids are all unique and kids are sinful just like we are. And there has to be a tension between respect and love, and there has to be discipline and loving motivation and all that kind of stuff. But you don't do it, first and foremost. So, vocational respect, seeking justice. And that applies also to our view of government, too. So when Romans 13 says, let everyone be subject to governing authorities, it says because God establishes those. Now, God also establishes their limited role in our life. Like we've talked about many, many times before, these people who are saying defund the police and get rid of the police, they're wrong. Because we need authorities who finally say this far and no farther. But I don't have a problem with saying, but we don't want police in every aspect of our life. And we sure don't want government officials in every aspect of our life. So if we want less of that coercive element in our life, then we need more of what? Moms and dads who love us and care about us because, we're their children. And so again, and then even the government has a role, but it's a much more limited role. So again, when we talk about this, that flows from the fourth commandment. That flows from a proper understanding of what is subsidiary to what. And so, teachers, you have a great role in the life of people, but parents, you're the ultimate teacher. Even in church, you're supposed to be the one that instills the values and even the gospel, for those who are Christian, in the lives of your children. That's not the pastor's job. He's to remind you, to train you, to empower you. But if you're parents, it's your opportunity, your job to actually do that in the lives of your children. And I think too many of us are abdicating these things and hoping someone else will do it for us. It doesn't work that way because subsidiarity is something that's written into God's creation. Honor your father and your mother is part of God's ordering of the world. And government, good government, flows way down the line from that. And that's, again, how our founding fathers understood it. Federal government was the most restrictive, or was supposed to be the most restricted of all governments. It was supposed to be state government, local government that answered to us. And then, of course, children answer to their parents, and parents answer to, their parents. And that was supposed to be how it was because we all finally answered to God. And so church and family, that was God's fundamental structures in the world, and government was a secondary one. So again, even as you want that, even that verse that says be subject to the authorities because God established it, yeah, but understand their role in our lives. And in America, we have the great responsibility of delineating the role of government in our life, and I think that's the big issue today. I don't really get, the kind of what I saw in politics this last year was really strange. Because we always, again, talk platforms, not people, and because we can talk all day long about some of these issues, but when we start to talk about what we want government to do, and I will tell you, if you're one of the folks who said defund police, get them out of our, there was problems that needed to be rectified, but if you were actually saying get rid of all that, period, then why are you voting to give the government so much control over the rest of our lives? You would think that you'd want, that across the board. And yet the very people that are talking about defunding police, abolishing ICE, and all those different things are also then saying, and give all control to the federal government on all these issues. It's scary to think about. I mean, basically give up all of your individual liberties to a group of people who don't care about you, don't even know your name. They may say that to you. They may say, I care about you. What's your name? And all they do is in fact, what's becoming even more problematic is people are not somehow identifying with a group now makes us feel more powerful. Actually, it's less powerful in the long run. Because government, if you start giving everything to government, they will begin to pit groups against each other. It's when you treat each other as individuals and then you honor individuals' self-respect before the law, when you honor their personal freedoms before the law and their responsibilities, but those are things that are personal and they take those responsibilities upon themselves. When you honor that, then we can make a difference. We can cross over all kinds of barriers and be good neighbors to one another. But when you start letting the government put us into groups. They will pit those groups against, and it'll always be for the sake of government and not for the sake of the individual, even the individual in those groups, by the way. So I see a lot of that going on, and I just keep going. The Christian says, no, these things, good law has to honor mom and dad first. It has to honor the individual before individual before the government, not government over the individual. And it has to honor the parents of the children, and all the authority lines then flow from there. Okay? So again, now that's why the Bible is so clear about obey and be subject. But does that mean that we just are subject willy-nilly to the government? Of course not. So even the concept of civil disobedience is when we say, wait a minute, the government's out of its lane, or this thing is not honoring how God wants these things to be done. And even there, it's not because of our passion for it. It's not because we're just so aggrieved. It's the fact that we're trying to be faithful and obedient to the way God does things. So Christian civil disobedience should always be something that flows from obedience. And a lot of the civil disobedience that I'm seeing today in our culture is not only out of bounds, it's ungodly. And it will be destructive in the end. So just one last thing then, so these are two papers you can read. You can start to see how we think through things. Two Kingdoms differentiates God's way of doing things and then holds it in tension. It's not just that God does things differently in the church or differently in the state as a matter of degree. So like he does it just a little bit less in the state and a little bit more in the church. He does it radically different in the state and through the vocations of people, even non-Christians, and then ultimately through the person and work of his son, Jesus. So, we teach you how to ask the right questions when you're dealing with these issues. WWJD, what would Jesus do? That's an evangelism question. That is not a public policy question. Actually, if you ask what would Jesus do, he'd say, do whatever the Father tells you. So whatever the Father says, WWFD, and there's all kinds of Bible verses like that. Be subject to the authorities. That's what the Father would do. Honor your father and your mother. That's what the Father would do. Thou shalt not steal. It's not your stuff. That's what the Father would do. You shouldn't covet people's stuff, even if they have something you really, really want. Honoring the name and the reputation of people. My gosh, if we even took that halfway seriously today, instead of trashing people's reputations as a rule of thumb, thou shalt not commit adultery, honoring marriage and what God's view of marriage is, all those kind of things are WWFD kind of questions. And when our laws begin to violate those questions, it's one thing if it doesn't answer all the questions, but it has kind of some roots in that, in those ways of doing things. But when they violate those kind of things, this is the kind of stuff where we as a society, we can't endure long, because we can't dishonor God and be a civil, humane society. One last thought, an LCRL rule of thumb for public engagement then, especially when it's controversial, is that our attitude should be one of vocational respect, even with those with whom we disagree, that seeks justice or seeks the truth. The other one is reformation restraint that seeks justice, which means we wait to have an opinion on things until we see everything flesh its way out. But again, vocational respect that seeks the truth, because that way of honoring authority as a rule, and then when necessary, correcting it, that is a spirit of order and peace, and that is going to protect us from violence, from injustice, and from tyranny. So vocational respect seeks justice as an antidote to tyranny, anarchy, and chaos. And again, when we seek that kind of level of civility and humanity, it's intended for one reason: to provide opportunity to proclaim the good news of the eternal salvation that comes only by grace through faith in Jesus Christ alone. So blessed Lent to you, and thank God that you have the freedom to honor and to direct your life and the lives of those you love towards what is ultimately important, your relationship to God. And again, thanks for the emails. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for supporting our work. And again, you can go to lcrlfreedom.org, lcrlfreedom.org, if you are prayerfully considering maybe supporting us, because we're in nobody's budget. We exist only by the free gifts of God's people. But thank you for partnering with us. Thank you for sharing with us, and also for caring about what's going on. And we'll try to be useful to you as you try to live out your two-kingdom life in this world for the sake, ultimately, of the gospel. So till we talk again, speak the truth in love with humility and grace. Be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Until next time, I'm Greg Seltz, and I'm saying God richly bless you always. Have a great day.